I've heard a lot of things over the last couple of days. The cracks letting the light in, thank you for that. I needed that. And just the title of this session, being reminded about the hope. This working full-time in safe sport feels heavy sometimes, and it's feeling heavy for me right now, but there are these pieces that I think are starting to come together, and there is hope, and I'm just really grateful to be reminded of that. I hold a bunch of roles. I have been in my career now for 25 years, so I'm a bit of a Swiss Army knife. I have a lot of different tools. Part of my background was as I did a Master of Science in Kinesiology with Don McKenzie at UBC a long time ago. And then I spent 20 years or so at the national sport level in cycling, both in Britain and in Canada, and did a bunch of consulting for other sports. So I've sat in the research area, I've sat in the national organization area, and now I work at Via Sport, which is, if you don't know who we are, we're sort of like Sport Canada, but for BC. So we're the in-between between the government and the funded sports. And so our role is, well, our new brand is all about make sport better, which ties in really nicely with this conference. So we are trying to make sport better. So as a researcher, I dove into safe sport a couple of years ago. I did lit reviews, I did gap analyses, I took a public health approach. I'm like, okay, we know what the gaps are, we know how to fill them. We made a bunch of resources. And then we were like, okay, let's put them out in the world. And it turns out that the world does not want to read a bunch of PDFs on your website. It turns out. So what I'm sharing here is the quickest, briefest summary of our work that I can possibly boil our work down to, because that's where we're at. We did an audit of what we created. We have 54 resources that we're trying to brand Play Safe BC. How do you do that? And so this knowledge translation piece, even for researchers, how do you boil this stuff down? And I keep being told, like, that's too much, that's too much, that's too much. So we're looking at trying to create a learning journey for people, and not just a bunch of 1 hour long e-learning modules, because I don't know about you, I did a lot of those over the pandemic. I am done. A lot of people are done. So how can we reach, well, we have 800,000 participants in the designated sports sector in BC, and that's just the designated sports. That doesn't count any of the other jurisdictions that we heard about yesterday. So how do we reach these people with things that they can actually use? And how do we want to frame safe sport? First of all, I don't talk about safe sport. We've changed our terminology to safety in sport, because the term safe sport has now started to mean maltreatment. And it's this weird Orwellian thing that I don't like. Most people on the street, we did some community summits last year. People either know a ton about safe sport or they've never heard of it. And so the word safety in sport makes a lot more sense to them. So that's why we're going with that. And what we want to emphasize is that sport can be amazing, right? It should be fabulous. It shouldn't be awful for anybody, not just the athletes, but for everybody involved. And thank you for the reminder today that includes parents. We need to stop seeing them as the bad people. They're stressed out. They're busy. Let's help them. So we're going to start our learning journey with building positive culture, building positive spaces. We keep talking about wanting to invite new people into the organized sport world, and even into just participation. We can't be inviting them into situations where they're not safe. So we really need to do this work around building positive culture. So that's values-based sport. Do we need to recreate this at Via Sport? I don't think so. I think True Sport has done an amazing job at that, and we need to start pulling the threads of our system together. If we did systems mapping on safe sport in Canada right now, I can't even imagine what that would look like. We've got too many things. And somebody said today, it's about doing less. So can we do less by tapping into what's been done really well already in other parts of the country and even other parts of the world? And also, where does equity, diversity, and inclusion sit in all of this? It's not a separate topic. It's like quality sport. They're all threads of the same fabric. They're so interwoven, and we keep trying to pull them apart, and they're not different. The equity, diversity, and inclusion pieces, that is how we create positive culture. So that's where that sits for us. And then the other piece of the puzzle, which is a big lift right now across the country, is trying to figure out, how do we handle complaints in this country? At the moment, we're talking about it specific to maltreatment complaints. And that's a big communications challenge. And I don't know if we've talked about that much in the last couple of days. Letting the people who participate in sport know about whatever our system is a huge challenge. How do we even reach these people? And do we really want them all to have to do hour-long e-learning training or full-day modules? People are being asked to do so much training and meet so many check marks. How can we make this easy for people? So a big part of my work last year was creating something called the flag tool for sport. And you can pull it up on your phone if you want to. The idea was we based it on an evidence-based model out of Flanders in Belgium from their child protection agency there called the FLAG system. And they ran training for coaches on how to identify what behaviors were okay and what behaviors weren't, and then how severe those were and what to do about it. And 83% of those coaches had gone back to their sports organizations within the 2 weeks after their training and asked for their entire organization to do the training. So it seemed like a model that people really engaged with. And so instead of making people do the training 800,000 times in BC, we created a responsive web page that you can save to your phone, works like an app, and it walks you through it's like an interactive survey. You're not putting in your witness contact information. You're not putting in your name. We don't track anything except how many people are using it. But it walks you through the rest of this learning journey, which is a behavior okay or not? People don't know. They're really confused out there. What can you do about it if it wasn't okay? And that depends on how severe it was. You're not going to give the same guidance to somebody who needs to report to child protection as somebody who just needs to have a conversation. And then if you don't know how to do those things, it links you through to those other resources, which are PDFs on our website still, but we're working on it. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you to SCRI for inviting me and my friends Kim and Deborah. If I wasn't nervous before, I was when I realized at 11:20 this morning that I had sent the wrong presentation and the wrong slide deck 3 weeks ago. And so an extra thank you to Gavin and to Veronica and to the rest of the SCRI team for getting me straight and getting this straight. Now I don't even know how to use this thing, so we'll figure that out as we go. So thank you so much for being part of this presentation. I say being part because I hope there's a conversation after, because I really fully believe in meaningful participation. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I come to this role as Safe Sport Lead at Sport Nova Scotia as a former athlete. The sport I mentioned yesterday does no longer exist. It has become the meme of many. I was a ballet skier, for those of you under 40. Yesterday was 30, but I think maybe even under 40. Look it up. It's a meme. It's a great sport, but anyways, it no longer flourishes. But I come to you from that background as well as growing up in a sports family. But I'm also a child protection lawyer by training. I did my master's of law, or my master of laws in child protection and constitutional law. And so that is marrying, when this job came up, I married my passion of sport and athletics with my desire to protect and to safeguard. And here I am today presenting in front and being with all of you today. So, and I am greatly inspired by the talks yesterday. Thank you, Eric. Thank you to those people who spoke yesterday and to everyone who's spoken today. And so I think the idea is to go through a few things that we are doing in Nova Scotia. I hope I can get this right. There we go. When I started 4 years ago, because I've been with Sport Nova Scotia for 4 years, this coming winter, we looked at what safe sport means, because again, this was 4 years ago. So the discussion is not the same as it is today. And Andrea and I have had some conversations. I sat with Joseph for a while earlier. I got to know him. It's going to be amazing. And we talked about this notion of safe sport. But what was talked about 4 years ago was that safe sport, and certainly the approach that I have taken in the work that I do, is more than the absence of harm, and arguably good and great sport is more than the absence of harm. Safe, the word safe has many different meanings. We did consultations across the province. Safe means a lot of things to a lot of people. And so in our responses and our actions and our goals need to include those things. That's what safe means. And maybe safe is not the right word, and I'm learning about that myself. And so we need to think about being inclusive, being welcoming, being diverse and accessible and fun. And I could go on. I taught a course at Dalhousie, and some of my students argued about should fun be included, but that's a whole other conversation. And then the notion, this is the platform from which we started, that safe sport is everyone's responsibility. And I think that came through yesterday in Eric's talks and the panelists as well. So to that end, we created in the first few months, I guess, of the work that we did was based on the work that was being done at Athletes Can at the national level. We said, well, we need to also engage the athletes at the provincial and community level. And I'm not sure if that's being done anywhere. It certainly wasn't being done at the time when we started. And so we had an athlete summit, and we recognized that the athlete's voice, as we're hearing now more and more, but certainly back then, again, this was 4 years ago, was the athlete's voice is critical into safe sport discussions. And so we held this athlete summit, and following the summit, I'm giving you the most time, I guess, sensitive overview of what we did. But we created, or an athlete advisory committee was created. It still exists. It's still active. We're in our second group. They created and they helped to create educational resources for their peers, including training. They have created, it's all on our website. So if you want to go to Sport Nova Scotia, you can see it. I created a podcast series. They thought that they asked for and recognized that there was a dearth of information for non-national level athletes, for university, maybe varsity, maybe, community athletes, mental health resources for that age group and that demographic. So they said, can we create a podcast series on mental health as it relates to them? And so we did, and we're continuing that. We're taping the next segment coming up in November, and those should be released probably December, January. So the second series. And then this athlete advisory committee is involved in ongoing projects, policy discussions, research, restorative justice, which I'll get to in 1 minute, some of the work that we're doing. The other big project to engage athletes is our Nova Scotia True Sport Athlete Ambassador Program. I'm so glad to hear Andrea, who has become a friend and a colleague, and I see my colleague and friend Liz out there from True Sport. This is a partnership that we created 3 years ago. We're entering our third year. It's a partnership between CCES, Canadian Sport Institute Atlantic, so CSIA, and Sport Nova Scotia. And it's a partnership where it's a values-based program, which is a component of Sport Nova Scotia's commitment to safe sport. And the goal of this program is to increase awareness, understanding, and engagement of true sport as the approach to values-based sport. The belief, and I think this is important, and I didn't include it in the slide, but it was discussed yesterday, but the belief is that when sport is values-based, it has the power to positively influence behavior and create a culture that instills character, strengthens communities, and increases opportunities for excellence. So that's the goal. We are entering our third year. We have some amazing athletes. We have our own Instagram campaign. It's an Instagram-based campaign, but these athletes are out in their communities demonstrating true sport principles on and off the field of play. So we're really proud of that. And then I guess the other major thing that we are working on, and what my passion, and if the first question, I don't know what Jen's going to ask, which of the three questions she gave us, but if there's an opportunity to discuss, is working in a restorative approach to sport. And this is my passion. This is something that I am full head on in and believe in. It's a partnership. We are partnering with the internationally recognized restorative lab from Dalhousie University via a MyTax fellowship grant. We recognize that restorative justice has been in use in Nova Scotia since the 1990s in various contexts, including some specific to sport. The restorative approach that we are looking at and examining includes responsive, so complaints-driven components, and proactive components. So that culture change that Jen alluded to, and Jen and I talk a lot about this too. It starts with a trailblazing model, which co-creates, collaborates. We heard that message yesterday. We are hearing it today, that we are here because we are trying to collaborate to make the sport better and more positive. But it's a trailblazer model which co-creates with the sport community a better way of responding when things go wrong, and uses what is learned, and that's key and that's critical. And if we get to that, and certainly happy to talk about it, we use what's learned, those stories that are told, to prevent future harms. So it doesn't stop at the harm. We learn, we tell stories, we learn how to move forward. It's a principle. It takes a principled approach. It shapes the way we think and helps in our design of policies and practices. The values that underline this restorative approach include care, concern, dignity, respect, and collaboration in all areas of sport and all levels of sport. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for being here today, and thank you to CERC for inviting me to speak on the topic of safe sport. So for the hopefully next 5 minutes, I'll be discussing some of the recommendations on how to advance safe sport here in Canada based on some of the emerging research I've been conducting within this space. So without further ado, my first recommendation is for us to consider reconceptualizing safe sport as safeguarding sport. And this isn't just a matter of semantics. So safe sport is limited conceptually and practically by its one-size-fits-all approach that assumes everyone experiences safety similarly, and is also limited by the sole focus on preventing maltreatment in sport. In comparison, when we consider safeguarding sport, safeguarding takes into consideration the elimination of maltreatment as well, but it also considers the elimination and prevention of other forms of harm within sport, as well as the importance of providing safe and effective care. And most importantly, it adopts a rights-based approach to consider the ways in which we can foster a space where every participant experiences the best possible outcomes. And so this limited approach of safe sport, in my opinion, we need to start deviating away from this and consider the value of safeguarding sport, which is considered the gold standard of athlete protection in the UK. So recommendation number 2, we must re-examine NSO governance. How many more examples do we need in Canada before we realize that self-regulation as a form of sport governance is an ineffective approach to safeguarding athletes? Between media scrutiny, between the failed adherence to the sport funding and accountability framework, and the lackluster efforts of responding to the calls to action, it comes as no surprise that maltreatment and discrimination remain persistent within sport. So the autonomous nature of sport organizations in Canada has been referred to as an interference from our responsibility to upholding individual rights within sport. So in order for us to advance a rights-based safeguarding version of sport, it's essential for us to revisit this concept of governance and explore what is required in order for us to establish a space where sport organizations are held accountable and there's full transparency with all Canadians. Recommendation number 3. So some of you may have heard of the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. And you may have also heard the extension of that, if it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to abuse one. It's imperative for us to take a systems approach. To date, most of the work empirically and practically has taken an individual approach or an interpersonal approach, focusing specifically on the experiences of the athlete or the coach-athlete relationship. And this limited approach takes away the salient factors that allow us to understand what the role of the organization is and other members within the system of sport. And so for us to advance safe sport, we need to start looking at these other key stakeholders who have a responsibility in safeguarding and protection. A systems approach also allows us to consider how we can standardize safeguarding sport, insofar that there's a similar conceptualization and framework for protecting athletes and fostering the best possible outcomes within sport across every province and territory, but also across every level of sport. The conversations we're having around this space have been operating primarily at the high performance level, and there are so many different sectors who haven't had the opportunity to benefit from the work of safeguarding sport. And the last thing I think any one of us here want today is to wait for another scandal before we start focusing our attention on all the other key stakeholders across the sports system. Recommendation number 4 is pertaining to program evaluation. And I can't help but ask myself, there's been several significant initiatives developed and advanced over the last few years, but is Canadian sport safer as a result of safe sport? Have we actually met certain objectives of safeguarding athletes? Have we actually fostered this positive culture of sport that everyone's talking about as a result of safe sport training or creating a positive sport environment or the rule of 2? And I would say some of the preliminary research that's coming out and some of the emerging research that I've been conducting as well would suggest otherwise. That we still see that equity-deserving populations are still disproportionately affected by experiences of maltreatment and discrimination. And so we've done a lot, yet we haven't assessed the merits of these actual initiatives. Now, no disrespect to these initiatives. I think it's an important step in the right direction. I was part of the development of, some of the initiatives on the screen, so I do see the value of them. However, we also are all aware of the limitations of online learning and how that actually fosters behavioral change. We know, the fact that with online learning, even though safe sport training is advocated as a 75-minute module that you can click through it in 10 minutes and still be safe sport trained. That's a problem. That's a problem if we're committed to actually safeguarding athletes. We need to start exploring or at least evaluating the merits of these assessments or these initiatives and assess what changes we can implement in order to advance this space. And finally, my last recommendation, it's imperative for us to cultivate meaningful partnerships in sport. So some of the research I'm conducting right now, exploring the challenges of operationalization and implementation around safe sport, has alluded to this theme of researcher-practitioner tension, which essentially stems from the conceptual ambiguity of what it means to be an expert of safe sport. Now, I don't want to go into the nuances of expertise and the professionalization of safe sport, maybe in discussion. I think it's an important topic for further consideration in this country. But at the core of this recommendation is the importance for us to collaborate with both researchers, practitioners, and other professionals in this space. We can't have these gatekeepers of safe sport that interfere with the advancement of evidence-based strategies. And so researchers are imperative in order for us to advance new findings, new developments, and then practitioners are also imperative in order for us to advocate these new findings through several different initiatives. So we need to cultivate better researcher-practitioner relationships within this space in order to ensure that we are advancing specifically a safeguarding sport culture. So let's deviate away from safe sport. There's no reason for us to limit our conception of this space by only focusing on the prevention of maltreatment, which erroneously assumes that if I prevent maltreatment, everyone's going to have a great sport experience. But that's not true. Just because I don't physically abuse my athletes doesn't mean they're going to have a great experience. But when we take a safeguarding sport approach and we prioritize cultivating a space where the best possible outcomes are reached, whether it's respect, inclusion, fairness, fun, by default, maltreatment does not exist within that space. So let's collectively consider the value of advancing safeguarding sport in Canada. Thank you, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you for the invitation to be here today and sit on such a distinguished panel. I was expecting a mic drop after that, Joseph. I don't know how I'm going to follow it. But really wonderful to be here and have the three of you talk about this. So I was host yesterday to this conference on values-based sport. And it occurred to me that we've been talking a lot about values-based sport, but yet do we really understand what values mean? And after reflection, although it was a fairly quick reflection because I went home and went to bed, I woke up today thinking to myself, maybe we should start by looking at why this is important. And I know that the Canadian sport policy will be released soon and we'll be addressing this concept further. And I think it's important for many different reasons. Perhaps most importantly is that it's such an elusive term, values, and that it can mean different things to different people. And so if we are going to have this kind of concept of values at the heart of change, shouldn't we understand what that means? Of course, we all have our own personal values, and we've seen and heard from everybody today many of the socially accepted values that we're striving towards. But I think that values have more meaning than those simple facts. When I've been doing this work for quite a while now, almost 20 years, and I asked myself the question, why do I continuously come back to this? Why is it important? And I think that it allows us a way to have conversations that can be provocative, but meaningful. And that when our own values are challenged, that's when true meaning can happen. And I do believe that in an organizational setting and a system level setting, this is in fact a very relevant conversation. One, because it helps us set strategy, and hopefully it helps us set strategy by co-creating with the many stakeholders that are part of the sports system. But it also provides us a level of understanding when it comes to ethics in sport and the philosophy that maybe we do not have in our sports system right now that could in fact be values-based. I often think to myself, is that an absence in our own sports system? And so the literature tells us that there's all kinds of different ways that values can be important in organizational settings and in system level settings, some of which you can see on the slides here. But coming to understand values, I think, is a very difficult and not simple conversation. As we talked yesterday a little bit, values take on many different forms. And our sporting infrastructure in Canada I would venture to say that excellence is at the top of the pyramid. And having looked around to many of the NSOs in particular, I know that that is in fact one of the espoused values that they lie in front of the public as a forward-facing aspect of sport. But as my colleagues, Alison Doherty and Shannon Kerwin and I are starting to unpack this further, we're also starting to recognize that an overcompensation in certain values like excellence and others are in fact leading to problematic aspects of maltreatment in sport. And so it begs the question, what are we aspiring for and towards? And what harm is it in fact having? And I didn't want to have today's conversation specifically about that research. In fact, I wanted to kind of present this idea to the audience today as a way of holding up the mirror and maybe understanding what it is that we're trying to do. What values are we maybe overcompensating for that are leading towards harm? And as a cultural researcher, when we look to the attributed or the realized values in our system, and that's where our work is at right now, we are starting to realize some lights in the crack, or what we would call as cultural researchers, gaps in understanding that can create unsafe sport, but can also be worked towards for safe sport. And we're looking at it from both perspectives in our research program. The thesis is actually quite simple. Understanding these values can allow us to shift to a safer future in sport. And it presents, I think, an interesting discussion for all of us here today about how we may redefine what excellence means, what respect means. What are these aspirational values that we hold so dear in our sporting infrastructure in Canada? Because should it always be about the outcome? I think most of us here in the room would say no, it should be about the process. And my colleagues here today have presented their case eloquently that should be the conversations that we're having. And so this research remains ongoing, and I'm expecting maybe next year at this time that I'll be standing up and presenting some of these ideas a bit further to you. But from my own research before the program that we've started, I think we don't do a very good job of understanding the perspectives of the different hats that are worn. And that's a missed opportunity to get things right. And I hope that maybe we can talk a little bit further about that today. So thank you.
We're now going to open it up to the plenary and ask for questions. I'll kick it off with one, and I'd like to just keep building on what Eric was saying about values, if we can. You've talked about different aspects of the sport system and the sport experience. I really want to highlight how much I love safeguarding sport. So not just the people within the sport, but the sport itself. You know, we risk losing sport and all that we know it offers our world. So beautiful teasing apart of language today as well with this panel. But let's talk a bit about the importance of values, building on what Eric's saying about how it drives behavior, practice, structures, and yet whose values, and how are we determining what those values are? What do you see the role of values playing in sport? Of what value is sport to Canadians in Canada? You can answer any one of these or all of them. And when we think about safeguarding and creating a safe place within sport, or a positive experience, is that mutually exclusive to this value of excellence, as sometimes people will say or argue?
I do have a little bit of a bee in my bonnet about this excellence versus well-being thing. And that comes from, I was a physiologist with Olympic cyclists. They want to be excellent, and I think that's a great thing to aim at. I saw some of them be excellent while also being quite well, and that's fantastic. And then I saw some of them be excellent while they were really, really not okay. And so when I came across, I think it's Anthony M. Grant has a chart, 2017, I think, and it's a well-being versus performance matrix. And the thinking behind that is, if you want sustainable, long-term, high performance, well-being is a requirement. And what I see, and not just with athletes, this is the other really key point, what I saw with my colleagues working in sport, what I've seen with board members and CEOs and researchers and everybody is that a lot of people are in the distressed but functional section. They're performing at a really high level, but they are not okay. And it takes one thing to tip them into distressed but dysfunctional. And that's not where we want anyone to be. And then the missing corner that I just love is high well-being and low performance. And we tend to think of that as being a really negative thing, or value of excellence, just like it creeps in there. And what that little area is recreation. That is me boltering around in my ballet class as an adult. Man, I'm terrible, but I'm loving it. And that's okay. Like, why does everything have to be excellence? And working at the community level now, I'm really starting to see that when we drive all of our thinking and all of our policies and all of our strategies down from the national level, they don't work at the community level. And so this excellence value doesn't match up with what most of sport actually is in Canada, which is, boltering, frankly. Happy acquiescent non-workers is what he called them.
Thank you, Andrea. Elana, do you want to go next? You look ready.
No, I hope I'm ready. I loved, Eric, what you said about language, and that was sort of the journey we started on when we looked at the notion of what safe is. And in some of our consultations with our athletes in the restorative approach process, we talked about what success means and what excellence. And the I think to whether it's Jen's or Eric's point, it's about the process. And what came up and from one of our athletes told us, success doesn't mean medals. Success means having friends. It means having just relations, and just relations, not justice, but just relations. It means connection. It means legacy. It means collaborating. And so I think that's very instructive, again, from a community level, what success and what excellence means. And I think I just echo my comments of my colleagues that language is important. And in order to get that definition or that meaning, we have to have that meaningful conversation. So participation, this is sort of one of our other points, is that we can invite people to the table, but unless we invite them meaningfully and want to listen, and I think meaningful, we need to have that word, meaningful participation at the tables that we sit at. And so that's where that comment on excellence and success comes from.
Thank you. And I'll just keep going, and then we'll open it up after we give each of Joseph and Eric an opportunity. Go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. So I would say that, when we think of excellence, the way we often conceptualize in this country is around performance and podium success. And, which recognize why without having to go into those details. But I would argue that positive values and this idea of safety that we've been talking about today is a prerequisite to that level of excellence. If we think about it practically, some of these traditional norms of no pain, no gain, play through injury, sacrifice for the game doesn't actually make sense. If I was a coach and I want, my athlete operating in the best physical and psychological capacity, it doesn't make sense to put that athlete out there when they're in a condition where they are, physically or psychologically unsafe, dealing with some type of issue that stemmed from my instructional habits or my coaching process. So I do think that positive values give us an ethical framework to reconsider or reconceptualize what excellence is. And I think when we operate through those positive values, those become a prerequisite to actually achieving excellence while still preserving the welfare and dignity of all participants in sport.
Thank you, Joseph. Eric.
You really have to get a mic to drop, my friend. Honestly, I can't follow you. Yeah, what he said. And it is such an esoteric term, values. And, yesterday, I forget who it was that was talking about a list of our organization has 40 values or 50 values or however many values they have. And the interaction of these values is causing ambiguity and difficulty in understanding what to do. And I thought the point was perfectly made. It's that, you could say a lot of different things and try to do a lot of different things, but wouldn't it make more sense to sort of isolate one or two that are actually achievable to work towards, as opposed to having so much on the table and on the plate? And that reductionist idea, I think, is actually one that could be possibly really helpful for a lot of organizations that are grappling with such a major issue and momentous shifts across our sports system. And that might be, and I'm not saying that it is, but that might be something to think about further, is can we identify those one or two or maybe 3 if we're really ambitious, concepts that we hold as aspirational values, and then work towards figuring out how to solve the problem when they're overcompensated or worked too hard towards.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to open it up to the floor now. We have a question up at the top there.
I don't want to start talking until the internet can hear me too. So I'm speaking from the NSO perspective here. I can definitely see like a reification of the whole concept of safe sport into kind of a collection of boxes that we have to check in order to comply with regulations. And that's why I love the concepts of safety in sport and safeguarding sport, because that really highlights the ongoing process and the fact that it is really a dialogue and a conversation between all of these interested stakeholders. And what I've seen organizationally is that on one hand, there is a real good faith belief in a compelling business case for increased diversity in sport, for all that proactive work to establish like a context and a paradigm of safe sport. But on the other hand, I also see like a skepticism and apprehension towards the imposition of mandates, like the incoming sport governance code, things like that. And I kind of I was wondering about best practices in terms of establishing space for conversation about, these tensions, because, our concerns about increased diversity versus imposed mandates, that's going to come from our values and our motivations. And what do we do on an ongoing basis to maintain that conversation and to be able to put our lofty organizational values that I'm sure we all put on our websites with fancy branded graphics? How do we hold the space to build those into a reality? Is my question.
Great question. I'll start with this one. I think 2 things that come to mind when we are, thinking about best practices to stimulate a critical conversation across the sport community. I think one is a community of practice, which I was recently invited to by Andrea, which brings several scholars and practitioners across Canada to discuss everything to do with safe sport. I can see on that community of practice what Andrea's doing out in BC, and I can see what Elana's doing out in Nova Scotia. And so it's a great way to connect with others who are committed to this idea of advancing safeguarding sport. And I think what's most important within these spaces where we are engaging these critical discussions is to ensure that everyone has a seat at the table. And so I think historically, most people driving this conversation were people in positions of leadership, coaches, sport administrators, but one of the main focuses of this entire movement is on the welfare of the athlete, and we need to ensure that athletes are also integrated within these conversations. I think there are other stakeholders missing from the conversation. Parents, for example, we've learned a lot about the role of parents within sport. If we can integrate them into these conversations as well, so they're aware of their child's rights and their right to intervene when they suspect or witness something that might be problematic within the sports space. So if we can foster more of those conversations with all the key stakeholders around this space, online, in person, through a community of practice, I think that's at least one step where we can engage in some critical discussions about safeguarding sport.
Yeah, and it's a great question. The first thing that came to mind for me is there is an obligation of the board to set the tone, right? And not to say that it should always start at the top, because as you indicated, like it can't just be from one single person or always directed from a top-down approach. That would be a mistake. But someone has to set the tone. And there's lots of practical ways I think that organizations could do more in this space to have the conversations and set the table for them. And obviously there are other tools that this system has. Athletes Can, for example, is definitely an arm by which the voice can be amplified. And those people that are running the show there, they need to have a forum to say more and do more. And so there's no simple way to say this, because it really is everybody's responsibility at the end of the day. But there are tools available that can allow us to engage in these conversations.
My only comment would be that best practices, and Joseph alluded to it, and Andrea and I get on calls and we hugged each other when we saw each other, because we speak all the time about what we're both doing at opposite ends of the country. And the key that has come to me is collaboration and the not operating in silos. I think about, much like Andrea in Nova Scotia, where we're dealing with complaints mechanisms and what that looks like in jurisdiction and all of that. And I recognize the difficulties with that, but certain things about education and prevention we can do together. And so I think that collaboration seems to me to be one of the key takeaways, and collaborating with my new research friends, because, they're also now my best friends too, but, and collaborating as much as we can, and sending an email or a text and saying, what are you doing and how can I be involved? And what can we do together? And we might be on opposite ends of the country, and we might need a researcher or a true sport or something to unite us and to get something going. But the key is really removing the silos and working together. That to me is how we create best practices.
In terms of how do you ask organizations who are at their eyeballs with capacity to do more? I think there's an onus on the funding agencies. So if we're going to be putting requirements in place, what metrics are we expecting people to track? We just went through a provincial sports organization evaluation in BC, and we asked people for metrics on diversity of their membership, and because a lot of them didn't have it. And that's a way to ask people to look at that and consider it. And then that kind of thing gets taken up to their board and it gets considered to be built into the strategic plan. So in terms of how you hold space in an organization, it has to be in the strategic plan, and it has to be a metric that you need to report to somebody else, because the resources are so thin and so scarce that those decisions won't get made unless they're built into the bones of the organization.
Thank you. And thanks for your question. I think we have to say farewell to Andrea, but we're really grateful that you made it.
Thank you so much.
Take care. Thank you. Other questions or anything online? Taylor, go ahead.
You spoke to the kinds of integral relationships that are required to advance some of the things that we're talking about. And so we have an attendee who's asking, how do we foster those kinds of integral relationships with stakeholders in sports safety? So parents, athletes, administrators, when largely the narrative is being set at the federal level.
Right, because I'm not at the federal level. So how do you foster? I think it's an expressed desire to make a difference. And I think that message has to come. And if anybody who knows me, the reason why I have 10 pages of notes is because I'm so passionate about this. And I had to put it down in writing, or else I would, be like a fruit fly. So I think that message, and I think also engaging in the why. And that sort of goes back to why sport? Why is it so important? And so if we think about safeguarding sport or safeguarding in sport, and we engage those people and those participants, and the why, and we answer the why is this important, and find out why it's important to them, I think we at least start that conversation. And then again, I go back to that meaningful discussions, meaningful participation. I think that's key. And that it's not those answers and those recommendations and their feelings are not held in a vacuum. I think we do have the ability to do that. Nova Scotia is relatively small. We do have the ability to do that, but absolutely we miss people. And that we'll keep fighting towards getting as many voices as we can, and working with researchers. And I truly believe in collaboration. And so if there's anybody who wants to do some good work, call me.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think there's a succinct answer other than to say we're all kind of grappling in the midst of change right now and trying to figure this out. And that's not me trying to cop out of it's just the reality. And I look around the room and I know many of the researchers in here that do community-based work, and they're the ones that can probably have the better answer than I can't sit up here and say that I'm an expert in this. But there's all kinds of reasons to bring this to our clubs and our communities, and the ones that are faced with these problems, where we know most of the maltreatment's actually happening, right? And it's a great question, and I don't have a great answer. I apologize for that, but it's just the truth of the matter.
I think just one thing to comment, the reference to things operating at the federal level, is very true. And I think if we rethink this entire process and we start looking at what can happen at the grassroots level and work bottom up, then that can also set an example for better practices at high performance sport. And so something as small as, community events and community engagement activities that allow parents to, become exposed to some of this content. I think one of the biggest disservices is that there's I don't want to say an absence, but a dearth of parent related education for sport, especially around this particular space of safe sport. And so, oftentimes parents deflect to the coach who has that responsibility to make those leadership decisions, and without knowing that oftentimes in this discourse of safe sport, what we're talking about is really, coaches violating the individual rights of athletes or other stakeholders violating the individual rights of athletes and other vulnerable populations. And so at the grassroots level, if we can start providing that type of education, trying to look for advocacy initiatives to engage parents and other stakeholders who may not be as well aware of this safeguarding space, I think that's one thing that we can start doing that will hopefully, trickle up the train and start making influences at a larger scale.
And Eric, you mentioned some great researchers in the audience, but I see Katie up there, Katie Meisner, who I know is going to be presenting tomorrow. I won't put you on the spot right now, but drawing, shout out to her session tomorrow, where she's really working with the clubs and developing networks. Thank you. All right, we have another question.
I have two thoughts. So one first, one of the things we've really missed talking about in all of the stakeholders today are officials. So they have incredible eyes and ears on the ground. And in terms of safe sport, that is absolutely a stakeholder we need to engage with. Okay, I wasn't looking for that. I'm going to give a hot take. Isn't that the word the kids are using these days? Janice and Joseph, I need to say thank you. I've had a reflection today, and here's a challenge I think we're all facing. I can't help but wonder, I've always believed in values-based sport, but I've had a reflection today to wonder if the way we define values-based sport is in a very white, cis-normative, hetero way. And the reason our values might be failing us is from a safe sport perspective where it's on the positive side, we don't have belonging because we don't have robust definitions that include everybody. And in listening in the last 2 days, I can't help but wonder if the first value that we need to define from everybody is, as it relates to safeguarding, is accountability and what we mean by accountability in holding our NSOs, in holding athletes accountable, in holding coaches, parents, officials, us as researchers accountable so that everybody can have belonging in this space. So how might you start defining accountability?
So I can address that, actually. So some of the research that we've done with coaches and administrators is pointing towards their lived experience as saying that we need to do more of this. It's almost absent in some respects from the athletes. Not entirely, but so it shows you that the stakeholders actually have a bit of a incongruence and dissonance with it. And to me, that's telling. Because that means we're not having the same conversations with the tripartite, if you will, the admin, the coaches, and the athletes that are, arguably they're the ones that the sports system's supporting and co-creating the culture with. And so I agree with you. That's such a critically important value, but I don't think it's seen in the same light either. There's nuance between how it's experienced and what people are saying is important in that particular value itself. And I think that is, in fact, a really important research moving forward, that we have to have more conversations about those huge values and what they actually mean to each person, because they are subtly different, and those differences are important.
Sasha, you bring up a really good point about, values and how genuine these conceptions of values are. I'll be honest, I don't use values-based sport because whose values are we talking about? I much prefer rights-based sport because rights are universal. Now, not everyone may not experience those rights because we live in a system that's not necessarily, equitable, but in a utopic space, when we think of it at its core, the right to feel safe, the right for access, that is fundamental to everyone, regardless of how, they identify and regardless of whether or not they agree or not. So it's not a discussion about your values versus mine and which ones take precedence within sport. With respect to accountability, an actual practical sort of, I guess, suggestion that I'd love to see is that we actually start seeing some of these organizations sanctioned for not meeting certain requirements. I put the sport funding accountability framework up there specifically because I think it's a really interesting example. You know, around the same time that Graham James was sentenced for the sexual abuse of Sheldon Kennedy, Sport Canada came out with the sport funding accountability framework saying, you know, every sport organization needs harassment and abuse policies. You need an arm's length abuse officer. And if you don't do it, we're going to cut funding. And then in Donnelly and colleagues' 2016 evaluation, almost no one upheld these requirements and no one was sanctioned. So where's the accountability? So we're having the same conversation in 2023 that scholars were having before I was even born. You know, we're just repeating things, but we should know better in light of the fact that we are essentially going through the same process that we went through decades ago. And the interesting thing, why I bring up safeguarding and I reference the UK is because in the UK, that's the dominant language. And when we had the Graham James situation here, they had the Paul Hickson scandal. And so, for some reason, you know, the UK started developing safeguarding policies and started collaborating with government agencies and sport agencies. And it's been an upward trajectory. Not to say they don't have their own challenges, but we have created a very interesting path and one that has been very cyclical, and we're repeating mistakes that we should know better. So I would love to see now, and we've seen that with some sport organizations being sanctioned, but let's actually see that being continued. As harsh as that may sound, I think that's what's required for people to start respecting the gravity of what we're discussing.
Yet another mic drop, I would say. And I want to leave everybody, because I'm a teacher, so I give people homework. I wanted to leave you all with a little exercise to reflect on a rights-based sport, reflect on that. But also this idea of why is it even important to you? I just came back from a race of masters rowers, and it was really interesting to see people posting their reflections on their results. And it rarely had to do with their results. It usually had to do with, wow, I'm so glad I improved. I was so happy to be here again after fighting a year of illness. I was so happy to see my former teammates. I was so privileged to have a beautiful day to row the Charles on, you know. So all of these other things that we find so important in sport. What is it for you? And what is it for the people around you? I think Lucy was asking us a similar question in her presentation. I want to thank all the panelists. It's really amazing how much work you're doing on behalf of all of us. But I want to thank all of you as well for your engagement, your interest, and your brilliance, frankly. Thank you. Take care.